Welcome to Disunion, the Government Union Report, the podcast where we delve into the ever-evolving landscape of public sector labor policy and law. I'm your host, David R. Osborne, and I'm excited to be your guide through the complex world of government unionization. We bring in experts and individuals with hands-on experience navigating the challenges and opportunities surrounding the unionization of government employees. From the latest legal developments to the practical insights that shape the policies, we've got it covered. So get ready to gain a deeper understanding of the news-making issues that impact public sector labor policy across the nation. My guest today is Miley Smith. Miley is the Illinois Policy Institute's Senior Director of Labor Policy and Staff Attorney there. She focuses on government union labor relations and the effect on Illinois taxpayers. She received her JD from Valparaiso University, and after law school, she clerked for a judge in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida. Miley, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I originally asked Miley to come on the podcast because we were working on a piece together on a state constitutional amendment that was recently added to the Illinois state constitution, and how that strategy, that particular strategy of adopting the state constitutional provision may be replicated in other states. We've already seen some attempts in Pennsylvania, California, Iowa, Minnesota, and Vermont. And that piece ended up being published in The Hill, if you want to check that out. But last week, Miley also wrote a piece about how public employees' union dues in Illinois are being diverted to politics in swing states. And I wanted to touch on that as well because I think it's illustrative of another common problem for public sector employees across the country. So back to the constitutional amendment. It's been almost a year since the amendment, which was known as Amendment 1. It was adopted by the voters of Illinois with something like 60% approval, which was, as I understand it, a close call for passage, given the high threshold for amending the state constitution in Illinois. So, Miley, what is Amendment 1, and why do you think voters took to it?
So, Amendment 1 was billed to the voters as a workers' rights amendment. So, right from the top, it had this innocuous sounding, maybe beneficial sounding name. And that's why I think voters took to it. But it really wasn't innocuous. It's actually very dangerous. And it does four things. First, it grants a fundamental right to unionize. And I always stress that fundamental part, because you and I are both attorneys. We know that sets the right at an even higher level. It's not just a right. It's a fundamental right on par with speech and religion. It expands bargaining beyond wages and benefits, those typical subjects of negotiation, to include broad new subjects like economic welfare, which isn't defined in law. It's not defined in our case law, could mean anything. And it prohibits lawmakers, as the people's representatives, from passing taxpayer-friendly reforms because it says that they can never inhibit this fundamental right. And also it bans right to work. So it's got those four provisions. And this is different than any other labor provision in any other state constitution, including all four of those things. So it really is the most extreme grant of government union power in the nation.
So the fundamental right, does that take precedence then over other constitutional rights in the Constitution?
I haven't looked how the Illinois courts have treated that specifically. But typically, if you've got competing rights, the one that is fundamental is going to win out. And it creates a different class of rights. So, I may have, a right to walk down the street whenever I want. But, that can be thwarted by, a parade coming down the street. That's not a fundamental right. A fundamental right must, if you are going to infringe on that, it has to reach a really high level of scrutiny in the courts in order for it to be infringed upon.
So how does this play out in court? I know that there's one case that's ongoing. I didn't know about it until you told me about it. Involving legislative employees. So legislative staffers, kind of strange to unionize legislative staffers, but it's been a thing that several states have opted to do recently. And Illinois is not one of them, right? The Illinois did not do this by statute, but legislative employees, citing this particular amendment, have started to organize. So tell me how that's playing out.
Yeah. So if only someone had warned that this was a possibility, which we did at Illinois Policy Institute. Historically, legislative employees have been prohibited in our state law from unionizing because of that conflict of interest, right? Like they're the ones that are moving legislation in a way, making sure their bosses see things, prioritizing things for lawmakers. And it would be a conflict of interest for them to also be getting lobbied by a union that represents them. So they were historically not allowed to unionize. But this amendment says employees have a right to unionize. So that's everybody. And the really, I guess, funny, ironic part of this is that the staffers, the legislative staffers in Illinois who went to unionize work for the Speaker of the House, Democrat Chris Welch, who was one of the supporters of the amendment in Illinois. So his own staffers are trying to unionize, and he is now saying, no, we have to change the state law in order for you to unionize, this old state law. But, you know, we've had Amendment 1 in the meantime, which says they have a right to unionize. So now that's in the court. The union and the employees have filed suit against Chris Welch, seeking unionization, saying that he has blocked their right under the Illinois state constitution to unionize. And so it's one of those, you know, from our perspective, I guess, kind of a funny result because they're using it against themselves here.
Yeah. And so tell me, if you're a clerk for a judge looking at this provision, how are you supposed to judge whether legislative employees can unionize under the language of the state constitution?
So, you know, if I'm just looking at this, it says employees, and it just that's everyone, right? It doesn't say employees not previously restricted. And in fact, there are some state constitutional amendments and some language that grant a right, but then throw some language in there like as provided by the legislature. So they still give some deference in other state constitutions to what the legislature provides. Not here. It just is a blanket employees applies to everybody.
Yeah, so you can pull up the language if you want, Article 1 of the Illinois Constitution, but here's the first sentence. Employees, that's what you're mentioning there, employees, unqualified, shall have the fundamental right to organize and to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing for the purpose of negotiating wages, hours, and working conditions, and to protect the economic welfare and safety at work. So it seems pretty broad. There's another sentence that seems to indicate that, so it says no law shall be passed, which is talking sort of prospectively about what the legislature can do. The fight, it seems, is over whether this also supersedes anything the legislature has done in the past, right?
Exactly. Yes. And that's what Democratic lawmaker Chris Welch is relying on. You know, that, oh, well, this law was already on the books, so it applies. It'll create a really interesting outcome because if that is what the court holds, then it does show there is some limit to the amendment, that whatever was on the books, at least before the amendment passed, still applies.
I just don't see, if I'm the judge in this case, or if I'm advising a judge in this case, I don't know how I could interpret this to allow, at least the first sentence, to allow for previously enacted provisions to remain on the books. I mean, if you've got a right to freedom of speech and it's constitutional, any statute, I'm putting my hands above, but the Constitution takes precedence over a statute.
Exactly. And especially if you look at all of the language surrounding the passage of this, as it was a bill and then as it was a ballot initiative. It was talked about as a guarantee for everyone. The labor unions were out there touting this as for everyone. It's going to protect all workers. I mean, they used that phrase, all workers. So those who were lobbying for it, campaigning for it, were saying it applies to all workers. You know, you look at the legislative history, the sponsor of the bill did say it probably wouldn't apply to the private sector, which we know we can get into that if we need to, but if that it applied to government workers. So if you're looking at all of the history combined, this was presented to the people as something that was going to protect all workers. In fact, I think Tim Drea, who's the president of the Illinois AFL-CIO, said something on a radio show like, if you get a paycheck, you'll be protected. So, you know, those legislative staffers, they get a paycheck. And so, you know, according to what the unions touted, they should be protected by this amendment.
That's interesting. In Pennsylvania, when a similar measure found its way into legislation, in Pennsylvania, some of these ballot initiatives start with legislation. The sponsors of it were under the impression that it only applied to private sector workers, but yet it was a copy and paste job. It read exactly as Illinois' provision did.
Right. And that was something that we got out there early on, and we're telling people this does not apply to the private sector because the private sector is already controlled by federal law. So it supersedes, it supplants whatever the state's going to do, to try to counter this overarching theme. And that's really all the unions did throughout the campaigning on this was it's for all workers. It's going to protect all workers. That was their message. It worked in trying to get the bill passed. It may not work for Chris Welch here as he's trying to ward off his own workers from unionizing.
Okay, so I've got some other scenarios here because I've been very curious about what this does to what at least we call in Pennsylvania, I think in Illinois, unfair labor practices. So unfair labor practices for the listeners are basically like unfair trade practices for the commercial sector. So that if there are certain things that unions cannot do, there are certain things that employers who are unionized cannot do. For example, neither of those can coerce public employees into making a decision on their union membership. Unions are supposed to allow employees to refrain from joining a union or participating in union activities, free of coercion. The employers are supposed to do the same. So that's just one example. There are several other things that have to do with the collective bargaining process. But I wonder, with regard to pressuring employees into becoming union members or not, how does this particular provision get enforced? Does it supersede unfair labor practice charges as well?
I monitor the unfair labor practice complaints, or at least those that reach the level of the board. And this has not come up yet in terms of, whether employees feel like they have been pressured into joining a union, not of their own choosing. But I do think it creates a really interesting scenario, that language in there that every worker has a right to a union of his own choosing. When you look historically at government unions in Illinois and all over the country, most people who are represented by a government union never chose that union. You look at Chicago Teachers Union, they were first recognized back in the 60s. And I actually did a hiring FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request recently to find out, when was the farthest back, the date of hiring of a teacher in Chicago, and it was 1970. So there's one current employee who was hired in 70, no before that. So that means there's not a single teacher within Chicago Teachers Union who actually chose Chicago Teachers Union for its union. And so that in and of itself is contrary to the language of the amendment.
So that's interesting. I wasn't thinking about this, Miley. You're saying that, so here's the language: employees shall have the fundamental right to organize and to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing. And it keeps going. But what if you didn't choose the representative? Is that compliant with this particular provision?
Yeah, I think it sets up a really interesting scenario for potential workers to either singly or band together and say, well, I didn't choose this union. We have not seen an unfair labor practice challenge or a lawsuit to that effect, because it would be very specific to potentially those workers. But there's all sorts of language here that, it's very broad, like we talked about. I also don't know that the unions themselves completely thought through how broad this is. It might be too broad for them.
I'm sure of it. Yeah, I'm sure of it. So here's why. The reason I asked that question is I was more focused on the language to bargain collectively. Collective bargaining, at least as we understand it, as it's used today, involves some coercion against minorities. I mean, bargain collectively is really in every state law about exclusive representation. So if you are a union organizer, what you're doing is installing an exclusive representative to represent not just the people who choose the union, but also the people who say vote against the union or don't show up to vote for the union at all. So collective bargaining is equally maybe a positive force for those who wish to be to be represented by a particular union, but also a coercive one for those who do not. I was wondering whether this particular provision would create a right for those in the majority to coerce the minority despite unfair labor practices or any other protection for the minority.
I agree. I think it would seem to coerce them there, but I have not seen any unfair labor practice complaints come through to that effect yet. And I think part of the reason is that we've seen a lot of workers just opt out of the union. So, those who are bothered by this have already opted out. Now, they're still, like you said, they're still forced into that representation. But as you probably know as well, a lot of times once workers are out of their union, they just don't want to have anything to do with worrying about it anymore. They're not getting my dues. That's fine. They represent me, but I don't have to worry about paying them out of my paycheck anymore. And it's hard to get someone who would want to challenge something in court based on that kind of legal scenario because they just want to be done with it. And it's understandable. It's understandable. When you see some of the unions like Chicago Teachers Union that are so militant, behave so badly toward workers who have opted out or who cross a picket line, it's understandable that, there are a lot of government workers who just want to opt out, keep their head down, and not worry about it anymore.
Sure. Makes sense. So here's another scenario. A collective bargaining agreement, once installed, increases pension entitlements. Can they do that? They can do anything, really, under this. So, and part of this is a little bit wonky, but before Amendment 1 was passed, most government unions, with the exception of teachers' unions, because we've got two different sets of laws, but most government unions already had a right to override state and local laws through their collective bargaining agreements. And like I said, that's kind of wonky, but what I mean is the state law provided that if there was a contradiction between the union contract and a state or local law, the union contract won out. So most government unions in Illinois already had that right just through state law. Now, everybody has that right because the Constitution has elevated the collective bargaining agreements basically to the constitutional level. So everybody, every union, government union in Illinois has that right. And we see that in a number of places. It was already happening, and there were some, little court cases here and there to determine if it was right or not for a collective bargaining agreement to trump a particular law. But, there's some pretty easy scenarios to see where this could come into play, particularly in the policing context, where we see, a lot of laws that are, could be perceived as anti-police, anti-safety, where they are making requirements of officers or police departments that maybe the police department or the union doesn't want. The union can counteract that just through their collective bargaining agreement. A good example is anonymous complaints. So Illinois has a state law that forces the investigation of potential police misconduct, even if it's an anonymous complaint. So, a collective bargaining agreement could say, nope, there will be no investigation of our police officers if it's an anonymous complaint, and that would override state law. You can think of it in licensing practices. So we pointed out during this fight before the vote that it would affect the Department of Children and Family Services, the hiring there, the licensing of social workers in the department that's supposed to be protecting children. They could override that. So there are all sorts of disciplinary procedures, hiring practices that could be overridden by a collective bargaining agreement. And we looked at the laws. We didn't look at everything, but we found at least 350 state laws that government union contracts could override if they wanted. So that's a good segue into what's happened with the Chicago Teachers Union during negotiations, which are they still ongoing now?
They are still ongoing. Okay, yes.
Okay.
It's getting kind of crazy. Yeah.
So you guys broke, as far as I could tell, you guys broke some news on this. What's happening with those negotiations, and what does it have to do with Amendment 1?
So earlier in the year, we were given a leaked copy of Chicago Teachers Union's demands for their upcoming negotiations. The contract hadn't expired yet, but we had this leaked copy. There were over 700 demands in this document. And it ranged from 9% pay increases every year. So maybe, something that would traditionally be bargained at least, to things like the district must be carbon neutral by 2035, that the district must give cash to asylum seeker families, that the district must put solar panels on buildings. So this, and they even called a wide range of their demands climate justice. I mean, that's their language. It's not us putting some sort of, pejorative claim out there. They wanted climate justice through this contract. So they have all of these demands. Just looking at those, we could estimate they would cost between $10 to $14 billion more than the last contract. So, I mean, just billions and billions of dollars worth of demands. Now, the context for all of this and why they can demand these things is Amendment 1, because like we were discussing, it just blew open negotiations so that government unions can demand anything. Lawmakers can't put any limits on it. So that also provides the teachers union, which already had a right to strike here, but now they have this permanent right to strike to get their demands met. And we know Chicago Teachers Union has a history of that's their go-to mechanism. If they don't get what they want, they go on strike.
Okay, wow. So two things here. One, you said that this constitutional amendment sort of blows wide open, I guess, what used to be the distinction for those who are interested, that the traditional labor law, the way that traditional labor law would deal with this kind of thing is certain subjects of bargaining, like wages and benefits, would be mandatory subjects. The two would have to come in together and discuss these things. And if they were unable to reach an agreement, there'd be an impasse, or at the very least, the union would have the right to push this to arbitration, something like that. But other subjects of bargaining are permissive, so the government could agree to certain things, but they don't have to. And if they refuse to continue bargaining over it, wouldn't go to arbitration. There may be some other things that are prohibited. I mean, so in the educational context, some state laws prohibit the local school board from bargaining over things like, curriculum or something like that, management type decisions over, what time the school day ends and what time it starts. But this particular constitutional provision says no law shall be passed that interferes with, negates, or diminishes the right of employees to organize and bargain collectively. So here you're thinking, and it doesn't just do it over wages, hours, and other terms of conditions of employment, but also any law or ordinance that prohibits the execution or application of It's in the first sentence. The economic welfare and safety at work. This is all really, really interesting. Second thing, you mentioned strikes. We didn't touch on that, but so what does this do? What does this amendment do with regard to strikes?
Well, the teachers and most government workers, so every government worker except police and fire, your emergency workers, already had a right to strike in Illinois, which is different, especially for teachers, than most other states. There were some restrictions there, they have to give notice before they go on strike, etc. But they pretty much had a broad right to strike already. Well, obviously now that can't be taken away because lawmakers can never go back and say, oh, we don't think you should have a right to strike so that our kids, can stay in school. We're going to remove the right to strike for teachers. They can't do that because the amendment says lawmakers can never inhibit this right to negotiate and collectively bargain. So that is a permanent right to strike now, based upon our state law and the Constitution.
Is there in Illinois, is there kind of a limit to the strike? If students aren't getting their full 180 days of education or something like that?
There's not. In fact, the only limit is that the government unit can go to a court and ask for an injunction, like a stay on the strike, if there's a public safety issue. This was tried in the CTU strike. I believe it was in 2012. Rahm Emanuel was the mayor of Chicago. He actually went to the state labor board, the courts, and asked the courts to bring the teachers back in because it had been, so many days, 2 weeks without school, and they refused. The court rejected it. So we already have some case law that has rejected the notion that, kids being out of school is a safety issue. So they could, who knows how long Chicago Teachers Union could go out.
Yeah. So this issue pops up in Pennsylvania periodically when a teachers union pushes the limits. And then it becomes a matter that the legislature gets very interested in. But you're right. I think if you look at this constitutional provision, there's really no way that the legislature could correct an imbalance like this. One would have to go and get a constitutional amendment passed.
Exactly. Yes. Right? And we already had an imbalance of power in the state of Illinois, unlike a lot of blue states where the government unions already had so much more power under our state laws. This has completely thrown the balance in their favor. So if you are a parent, a taxpayer, you really don't have a say in how this plays out. And I think one of the lessons that was learned by CTU will probably be learned by large militant unions in other states if an amendment like this passes, is that they can now, we talk about, I know I'm going off a little off subject, but we already talk about in labor circles how government unions can basically hire their own bosses because they do political contributions to politicians' campaign committees, then they get elected, then they sit across the negotiating table from the union. So it's kind of like hiring your own boss. CTU is the prime example of that because what they did was in 2023 poured millions of dollars into the campaign coffers of Brandon Johnson, who is now the mayor, who was one of their former employees, and now he is mayor. He was not, even just a couple weeks before the election, he wasn't even in the top 4 of the candidates. But CTU poured money in, got him hired. Now they're sitting across the table from Brandon Johnson. So they've hired their own boss, and they have Amendment 1 to push these crazy demands. They almost don't even need the right to strike in this scenario because they have a friend on the other side of the negotiating table. And that is something I think that people in other states need to be watching because this is that blueprint for, you get that broad amendment, you pour money into a campaign, you hire the person, and you could get anything in your contract.
All right, well, let's switch gears here. I wanted to talk about your most recent piece on the Illinois Policy Institute's website. The headline is Illinois Government Workers Union dues being diverted to swing state politics. So you're talking here right now about a union using dues to hire their own boss, but it looks like they're also using members' dues to hire other people's bosses.
Exactly. Yeah.
Tell me a little bit of how this works.
Sure. So we looked at some of the largest government unions in Illinois. So we looked at AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the teachers unions, and SEIU, just to see how much money are they pouring into the Democratic Party committees. So not necessarily individual campaigns like, the senator down the street, but the Democratic Party committees, because what those committees then do is once they have that money, they can divert it anywhere they want. And we had heard, it was actually during the Democratic Convention, the DNC, which was in Chicago. It was during that time that the Illinois Democratic Committee started hinting that they wanted to make some strategic investments in swing states. So basically that means they wanted to take some of the money in the Democratic campaign committees in Illinois and start pouring them into states where it could make a difference. Because, we all know Illinois is a blue state. It's not going to go red this election. And so they wanted to use that money to affect the presidential outcome in swing states. Now, here's the problem with that. The money that's in those Democratic Party committees hasn't been donated solely by Democratic voters, Democratic donors. Some of the party's resources come from Illinois government worker dues. And we see this. We can track this through our State Board of Elections. We see that the unions put money into their political action committees, and then you can watch that trail of money go. It goes from the union to the political action committee to the Democratic committees, and then those Democratic committees can put the money anywhere they want. And, we talked earlier about workers who have opted out of the union. There are some workers who have not opted out of the union who would disagree with this use of money in general in Illinois, but they may think, oh, well, it's Illinois. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be a blue state anyway. But now their money is being shifted to other states against their potential interests. And if we look back at polling from the last 2 election cycles for president, 40 to 45% of Illinois workers and union workers nationwide voted Republican. And so this money is being diverted to political action committees and to other states now against their own voting preferences.
Okay, let me make sure I have my definitions right. Member dues are the kinds of, this is the money that members pay as a function of their membership in the union. The union sets those amounts by some internal structure. And typically money's taken out of people's paychecks and sent to the union. It's supposed to be totally separate. There's a thing, political action committee. You might make contributions, same employee, same paycheck, but a PAC usually the state will require that you sign something separate from your membership application to indicate that money is taken from you voluntarily to be spent on overtly political things like giving straight to a candidate.
That's what union members think in Illinois, but that is not the case in Illinois. And you can see the unions will even sometimes label it in the State Board of Elections records as dues to the political account. In fact, in 2023, when Brandon Johnson was elected mayor of Chicago, CTU was using member dues. It created a ruckus because there were members who didn't think they could use the money that way, that the House of Delegates hadn't voted on it. But in the meantime, CTU voted internally to apportion more money from dues to their political account. So that sounds very legal, but basically what they were saying is we're taking money from your dues to put into politics. And they can do that. They can do that. Once the union has the money in Illinois, they can use it however they want.
Including giving it directly to a candidate?
Well, they give it to their political action committee, and then the action committee gives it to the candidate.
Wow. Okay. Well, it is a problem nationally. I was unaware of this, but it is a problem nationally that member dues go to politics all the time. They may not be able to give it directly to a candidate in certain states, but they can spend it on, an independent, uncoordinated campaign for or against a particular candidate. And I think Citizens United probably allows for that. But that's totally separate from the ethical obligation that a union might have to its membership.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
But this is even more concerning that they can put it directly in the PAC and then do something with it there. More concerning that an Illinois-focused public employee, even though Illinois may be solidly Democrat, there may be local elections that they would find in their interest to support. But the unions are taking that money and sending it out to what? Tennessee?
Wisconsin. They've
Pennsylvania?
Specifically about Wisconsin and the swing states. I think Dick Durbin, the senator here, talked about we need to adopt Wisconsin. So in this election. and the thing is, if you look at the map of voting patterns for the last, I don't know how many presidential elections, you will see that there is a pocket of blue in Illinois, in Chicago, and the majority of the state votes red. So all of those, government workers and what we call like downstate Illinois are not likely voting for a Democrat. And yet their dues money, if they're a government worker, is being taken and used against their own interests. And like I said, in former elections, maybe a worker might not see it as big of a deal because a lot of things in Illinois are going to go blue anyway, so maybe it doesn't matter. But now that money is going out of the state and could affect the presidential election if they're pouring millions in like we've seen them do before. Fascinating.
All right, Miley, where can people find out more about your work and follow you online?
So if they would like to follow more online, illinoispolicy.org. But we are also on Instagram and X and Facebook and all of the social media places.
Got it. Great. Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. And I'll be following closely. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Disunion, the Government Union Report. We hope you found today's exploration into public sector labor policy both insightful and thought-provoking. Special thanks to all of you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's discussion and want to stay informed about the latest developments, don't forget to subscribe to Disunion, the Government Union Report, on Spotify or your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us. I'm David R. Osborne, reminding you that understanding labor policy is crucial for shaping the future. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep making a difference.